will go ahead and transition to this next panel. Thanks, Yolanda. Dr. Harper is going to be sharing her screen. We have Dr. Yolanda Harper. She is a professor in the College of Arts and Sciences. We have Dr. Stephanie Anderson, who is also an assistant professor in the College of Arts and Sciences. And of course, Dr. Dana Dillard. She teaches in the BA and MA for psychology in Cass. And then, of course, last but not least, Dr. Kara Metz, who just presented to you all. She's the program lead of the BA in Health and Human Services. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Thank you for joining us. We should get everything kicked off in just about 1 minute.
So if you've been with us for a while, get up, stretch. Do some jumping jacks, dance a little bit.
And again, thank you so much for being here. Hello and welcome if you're just joining us. This is our last segment of Cultural Competence, the Elephant in the Room. I'm Holly Lopez and I'm lead faculty here at UAGC, and I'll be hosting this session. By joining us today, you acknowledge that this session is being recorded and will be shared with TLC related materials. Microphones will be muted for this presentation, but we encourage you to post questions and comments in the chat. Also, we have enabled live transcription. If you would like to use it, click the live transcription button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And now I am pleased to announce again your presenters or panel presenters for this last segment of the session, Cultural Competence, the Elephant in the Room, addressing different beliefs at the micro level with Doctors Anderson, Harper, Dillard, and Metz. Thank you so much, ladies, for your expertise. We look forward to what you have to share with us today.
Thank you so much, Holly. So I'm going to stop sharing now that we're getting started, and we're just going to chat with you. So thank you all for joining our session. I'm Yolanda Harper, and I'm pleased to have with me our co-facilitators, Stephanie Anderson, Dana Dillard, and Kara Metz. If you haven't seen everyone's session, please stay tuned. You can go back and review the videos once they're posted. Okay, Stephanie.
Just to share a little bit about how we're going to run the panel, we're going to ask a series of questions to the panelists. We're welcoming thoughts and examples in the chat from everyone who is in the room. And in fact, we're highly encouraging that level of interactivity. And in the end, after we've gone through our series of questions, we're going to open it up for additional questions and to address any of the things that have come up in the chat that didn't get addressed at the time. So again, we would encourage as much participation as possible.
So as indicated by the title and description for this panel, the sessions in this panel discuss several types of diversity that are often not the primary focus in diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations. Of course, many of the principles do apply to various types of diversity, but we also introduce some other topics that are often not included. And there are a variety of reasons that these types of diversity might be overlooked. One being that the need to address them may not feel as urgent because they may not be found because they may actually be found among individuals with more or lesser privilege alike. These types of diversity may not fall into protected classes and so may not be the focus of high profile media or even hate crimes. However, they can be embedded in institutional discrimination and bias and allow biases related to these types of diversity to go unchecked and can chip away at organizational effectiveness because they are going unchecked. So what are elephants in the room? Technically, the elephant in the room could be any type of diversity that is impacting interpersonal interactions. As an elephant is large enough to block our view, these elephants in the room are noticeable to some and make it difficult for them to see past the elephant to be fully present with the other individuals present. Like other forms of diversity, these types of diversity can involve different beliefs, mindsets, and behaviors. What makes these elephants particularly challenging is that not everyone sees them. And even if they do see them or perceive the differences, interpretations may vary widely regarding their salience, their importance, and how to respond to those particular types of differences. The title of this panel also includes addressing different beliefs at the micro level. So we will include strategies to become more respectful of others' identities and beliefs toward the ultimate goal of improving institutional cohesion and effectiveness. Stephanie will begin by reading the first question that we have for our panelists.
Our first question is, when you think of diversity, what are some of the most salient dimensions you find yourself addressing? And we'll start with Dr. Kara Metz.
I think about some of the most salient dimensions that I'm addressing. A lot of this has to deal with the field that I am and the classes that I am teaching. So mental health comes up a lot, not only with our students' mental health issues, but we're dealing with a lot of those issues and learning how to communicate and understand those in our world and our profession, the people that we might be working with, and understanding how to communicate and work with those individuals. One of the biggest things that I tell my students, I tell my clients, I tell people is be careful of the identities that we take on. So with mental health, something easy is like, I am bipolar, instead of saying I'm dealing with this. So not putting all of your identity in that one basket, because you are complex. There's a lot of different things that you're dealing with. Also within the classroom, I think we can all relate to the fact that disabilities come up quite a bit, and it's going to impact not only needing that extra time, but it's also going to influence how we begin to look at some of the questions and assignments that we're given. So I see that as a huge one. Dana?
I think Dana had something to add to that. Thank you. That was great, Kara.
Dr. Metz, you're a hard act to follow. I thought I had a focused answer for this question, but I find that the more I learn, the less I know. The pandemic has offered a pretty unique opportunity for reflecting on students and how they learn and how we can best support them, particularly when we may be facing stressors of our own. Two of the dimensions that I've had to recognize and navigate are poverty and personality. From some discussions with peers, it was expressed that the pandemic was believed to be a great equalizer for higher education, that transportation was no longer going to be a barrier because school was online, and housing costs should be non-existent because everyone was in lockdown in their own homes. However, for me, teaching college classes to students in rural high schools highlighted that the pandemic was not a great equalizer, but rather further distanced those who have from those who do not. Students living in poverty did not have consistent access to internet services. Instructors who demanded that students put their video cameras on risked exposing homelessness or living conditions that students did not want to share. Students who could not put on their video cameras due to internet limitations or other considerations risked being chastised or marked down. Students who had to watch over siblings were not in a position to attend to learning, and students who received breakfast and lunch assistance through the schools may have gone for extended periods without food. The pandemic did not reduce these disparities and barriers. This also occurred with students along the introversion and extroversion spectrum. Extroverted students were not stimulated enough sitting in front of a video screen for hours at a time, especially with limited person-to-person interactions. And more introverted students felt like they were under a microscope, being constantly watched and asked for discussions and reactions. Having these experiences with students from communities that I know well made me realize just how little we do know about our students in the online environment. Although it was limited, I had access to information on some of my high school students, and it made me very aware that there are many students that I will never have any idea of the barriers they are facing in their fight for education. I don't know that I know the dimensions that I have to address, rather that I need to be sensitive to and alert to the cues the students are providing that will help me support them in the ways that they may need.
Thank you so much, Dana. Our second question is, share with us ways that you have found diversity to have an impact in the online class specifically. And I know you touched on that a little bit, Dana, but Kara, did you have something to add?
Yes, like I had talked about in our presentation, especially in the online environment, various cultural aspects and diversity aspects can become invisible. Students can easily just not talk about things that might be impacting them. So one of the biggest things is students might not be as forthcoming with their needs based on what is happening with them and their culture. And so in a regular classroom, we might see them face to face each week, and it would be easier to contact them and make those connections, where in an online environment, to really get to know the students, their culture, and how their culture impacts how they do their work, the time that they need to do their work, and the influence of the material, we have to be more proactive. So we need to reach out to the students. We need to find new ways to get connected. The more that we can demonstrate that we are a safe person to be able to examine and explore some of those impacts of culture, the sooner that we can do that, the more forthcoming that students are going to be in talking about those ideas and talking about their needs. Also, I talked a little bit about in my presentation how, because of the permanence of online education is with discussion posts being posted online, sometimes students can hold back or are not genuine. This can impact people really doing that self-exploration that's needed in some of those classes that they take. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dana, was there anything more you wanted to add to that one?
Oh, I can always add things. Thank you, Dr. Harper. When I was looking at this question, I was considering some of the positive effects that diversity in the classroom has also had. And what I've noticed is that diversity in the classroom creates a rich learning environment when students are engaged to share their experiences in translating and applying that material. The application of the material to their personal lives improves the student retention of concepts, but just as importantly, it introduces others to new perspectives. In one class, we use the 20 statements test, the series of I am statements to introduce ourselves. And I include myself here because I post my own version to help create connections, trust, and social presence. While the activity allows that analysis of cultural considerations and expression of identity, it also promotes students to identify differences and similarities with classmates. And students begin to explore what identity dimensions mean and how they impact beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. Again, it builds very rich conversations. For students who identify as introverted, it's interesting. They often start by apologizing for those tendencies and emphasizing more extroverted qualities. But once they see other students with introverted tendencies, they start to share stories and examples. And this helps engage students who are identified as extroverted because they want to learn more, they want to talk more. And it creates the potential for additional dialogue. It's not always positive and it may require mediation, but diversity in the classroom creates spaces for that dialogue. The presence of diversity also helps students identify new strategies for solving problems that may not have been previously considered. And because of the nature of the classes I teach, this generally begins as a critical reinterpretation of beliefs about the role of biology and behavior, which can in turn lead to dialogues about beliefs and stigma regarding mental illness and treatments. I've been fortunate to see online discussions rooted in research and theory turn into critical interpretation and community action. This respectful dialogue and guidance in navigating research and diversity in the classroom becomes the point from which positive social change can begin. Thank you.
Thank you. Yolanda, I have a question for you that I'd like to weigh in on as well. Can you share some ways that you found diversity to have an impact in the workplace?
Well, certainly for some individuals who tend to be drawn towards people like themselves, because just more comfortable with similarity sometimes, we could see cliques forming and kind of different versions of what sometimes was called the good old boy or good old girls clubs. And so by that, people can miss out on opportunities because sometimes they're offered to people in the in-group before. And it's not necessarily intentional. It can be in more malicious settings, but oftentimes it's not, oh, by the way, this opportunity is coming up, this committee, this new course or whatever. And so just because we're around those people more, it just becomes a part of conversation. And so people on the in-group hear about them first and are already primed and prepared to volunteer. So people outside of the loop may eventually assume a posture of learned helplessness and stop expending energy trying to get noticed or trying to be included. They may withdraw. They may become disengaged from the organization or the unit. They may avoid in-group members or not trust the in-group members, or may even start or join marginalized cliques. They may feel being with, as an out-group member, they may feel being around those in the in-group to be draining. And again, that can feed the avoidance. So some things we can do are to be intentional about making sure we make opportunities known and advertise them, communicate them in many different forms over and over again, in writing, in many different meetings, as well as orally. And as much as we can check ourselves, if we notice we're among a smaller subset in our unit, to hold off on bringing those opportunities to that conversation until there are more people that could be a part of the dialogue and to hear the opportunities. And then even when the opportunities are out there, don't just take the first one who volunteers. I've sent an email, said this opportunity is here. I'm just going to take the first one of volunteers. Well, that may lead about the person who is away picking up their child from soccer practice or from, in the emergency room. So give a little time, give a little space, and find out why people are interested in participating, and how can we engage as many people as possible, and checking in with them. Okay, now what opportunities did you miss out on? That if a similar opportunity comes up again in the future that you're really passionate about, you'd like to be thought of. So those are some things that can be helpful.
Excellent. I just want to add to that. One of the things that we talked about in our presentation is the very wide range of aspects of diversity and how we overlook some of these things. And so one thing that I've noticed is we sometimes tend to assume that others who are like us in some ways are like us in a lot of ways, or even all ways, and that everybody in an institution or in a position or a role maybe feels the same way or thinks the same way or has the same sorts of experiences. And when we have those assumptions, that can lead some people to feel silenced, not purposefully or in a mean-spirited sort of way, but if it feels as though there is a general trend in one direction, it makes it difficult for someone to share, especially as Dana was mentioning, if a person is maybe by nature a little bit more introverted, then the idea of taking that step to be vocal and to put forth or assert a different perspective can be really intimidating. Because of course, we have to also consider that within any workplace, there's also a hierarchy involved, and that creates an additional level of tension in terms of expressing diversity potentially. And so I think it's good to, as Yolanda was mentioning, be intentional and offer opportunities for people, not just to participate in terms of action, but in terms of voicing differences and allowing those opportunities. So definitely there are also some positive effects of diversity in the workplace when we take those additional steps of being intentional and inviting people to participate and to share. Then we have the ability to avoid groupthink and making poor decisions on the basis of limited information. So it's really important that we do take those steps and we do broaden our perspective and allow diversity to have the positive effect that we know it can have, rather than limiting voices from different perspectives.
Absolutely. Okay, we have a question for Kara. What do you do to create a safe learning environment for all students?
That's a great question. So I addressed this a little bit in my presentation, but a few things that I do is one of the first things I do is try to establish my intent. This helps, again, there's this natural power differential, but this helps to lessen that a little bit. My job is to help my students to learn, meet their needs, and really get their goals accomplished for this particular class. I might have a lot of knowledge, but I don't have all the knowledge. And by encouraging students to share where they're coming from and their own personal experiences, their own personal culture, as it relates to the material that we are learning, they start to become the experts within their own realm. So this can be really helpful to create safety of ideas, that they're going to be able to be free to share and that their ideas are valid. The cultural aspects that they're bringing are important, and really add a lot of dimension to what the class can bring. I also try to model different behaviors. So one behavior that I model is I am human. I make mistakes. I might say the wrong things. If I make videos, they're not perfect. I try to show that human side of myself, so the students also feel like it's okay to be human and it's okay to be where they're at with their understanding. I also try to apply empathy. As I said, my identity really is a counselor. And so empathy and just Roger's ideas of unconditional positive regard, being genuine with my students, all of that helps to create safety so that people feel understood and that where they're coming from is valued. I also am trying to be aware of myself. I have to know myself, know my own values and how that influences my own thoughts and my own perspectives, and to try not to let that influence how I interact with my students if it doesn't add value, or if it maybe is too one-sided. And finally, I try to be an advocate. I think the empathy and establishing my intent helps me be an ally, but taking that one step further, being an advocate for students' cultures and getting their needs met. Maybe we realize when we're working with students that some of the things in the courses aren't great for different cultural aspects, where if it's from what Dana had talked about, or if maybe we're not addressing enough culture within the classroom environment. And so how can we make some of those small changes or bigger changes to the classroom so that we can really give a well-rounded education that makes everybody feel heard and valued, but it also means that we might need to advocate for our students for services that they might need. And so not only just telling them, but how can we take that a step further to ensure that their needs are being met? And so I see that as being an advocate. And so I feel like if people not only feel like they're that you as an instructor are on their side, but you're also willing to fight for them, that creates safety within that environment.
Excellent suggestions, Kara. Thank you. Dana, I want to turn to you. In your presentation, you spoke about personality prejudice. Can you tell us what you mean by personality prejudice and some key points that we as instructors should be aware of related to this type of prejudice?
I can try to. As with most of the dimensions we see discussed, there exists this potential and even likelihood for cultural and social preferences. These preferences may arise out of experiences, socialization, information or misinformation, fear, threat, error, or assumptions. And these preferences, unconscious or otherwise, may lead to negative beliefs and attitudes towards those who are not members of a preferred group. In the United States, there has been an emphasis on the importance of having a loud voice, of being the loudest person in the room, of being comfortable in the spotlight or of being a good team player, and of being suspicious of those who need or enjoy solitude. Being quiet is likened with submission or considered a pathological flaw. In the classroom setting, the preference for the extroverted ideal is apparent on the emphasis on group projects and student-centered discussions and collaborative learning. And I've seen this leak through onto online settings as well, where there are attempts to require group projects and collaborative learning. And it is very difficult for that to translate into the asynchronous environment. Introspective and reflective learners may be labeled as lazy or disengaged. In a misguided attempt to cure introversion or make introverted students appear extroverted, instructors have been known to force students to sit in noisy, crowded group seating arrangements in those face-to-face settings. And because instructors are viewed as the knowledgeable expert, instructors who say things like, "What's wrong when someone is quiet?" is reinforcing the idea that quiet introspection is deviant, distasteful, or pathological. It leads to the point that Dr. Rosser Majors had made in the comments is we become the elephant in the room. We become the barrier that we can't see past. Sometimes the student needs to sit in solitude to process and reflect on information, and instructors need to be respectful and responsive to these varying needs. As educators, we need to take our time to reflect, to try to understand where our biases may reside. This is a point that we all keep circling back to. We have to understand our own beliefs and our own biases, and we have to learn to recognize those. And we have to identify those behaviors and words that we have used that may have created those barriers for students. And this does mean admitting when we were wrong. I can recall with a great deal of shame in retrospect, a time where I shut down an extremely extroverted learner. We were doing a class exercise on observational learning, and this student was really enjoying the activity. The student was fully engaged. I interpreted the student's behavior as boisterous and disruptive. However, the student wasn't bothering anyone else. It was just my belief about what the activity should look like. The student may have walked away with an understanding about modeling, and I regret thinking about what that student learned about modeling, but I stole from the student the joy of learning, and I replaced that with shame for getting so caught up in an activity. There have been very vocal advocates for introspective, sensitive teaching and learning, and this includes William Lawrence and Susan Cain. And I agree with them 100% about their assertion on that importance of validating the experiences and needs of more introverted learners. But we also have to be aware not to intentionally or unintentionally swing the bias in the opposite direction. We need diverse classrooms that promote all of those voices. And this means letting the louder voices share ideas with others with excitement to deepen their understanding, and letting the quieter voices have opportunities to go into a quiet space, into their solitude, to write out their thoughts and to share their ideas in a different format.
Very helpful. Thank you, Dana. Yolanda, did you have anything to add to this?
Oh, just a little bit. Dana did a fantastic job of discussing personality prejudice, specifically as it pertains to introverts and extroverts. I'd like to add just a little bit about a group on that continuum that gets even less attention, the ambivert. When Carl Jung proposed the theory, he actually included ambiverts. And some of the characteristics of the ambivert are that they enjoy others, but they also still need their alone time. They can be very comfortable with being outgoing in the right context. They can be effective on teams, but often prefer to begin some of their pre-work independently and bring that to the team. And they can process information out loud or internally. And in fact, research suggests that actually the ambivert personality style is more common than both introversion or extroversion. And because the focus is usually on the two extremes, those with the balanced characteristics of both introversion and extroversion, or the ambiverts, are often ignored. They're not perceived at all. They may be misperceived by introverts as being extroverts and misperceived by extroverts as being introverts. They're not as readily able to receive validation on those full personality tests that have only bipolar response options, which are sometimes used in the workplace for team building. So if you are annoyed by those tests that make you read a list of statements or characteristics assumed to be opposites and force you to choose one or the other option, while everything else in you is screaming, neither, it's both, it's not either or, it's both, you might be one of the invisible majority of the ambiverts. So that's all I wanted to add there. Stephanie, I have a question for you. In our presentation, we addressed ways to increase self-awareness of unconscious bias statements that can hinder teamwork and collegial relationships. Would you share an example of an unconscious bias statement that was brought to your awareness and how you addressed it?
Sure. So I'm actually going to share an example of unconscious bias, not simply a statement, but an unconscious bias that I became aware of. At one point, I had an assignment for students to complete the IAT, or the implicit associations task or test. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to be talking about it, I should probably complete this measure myself, as Dr. Dillard was talking about with the 20 statements test. And share my results and my analysis with the class. So I took a version on sex, because I thought, of course, that seems like an easy one. I'm a woman. I value women's contributions. This should be a slam dunk, easy thing for me to take and complete. And when I got the results, it indicated a level of sexism that I was not comfortable with seeing, and I certainly would not have ascribed it to explicitly. And so that forced me to take a step back and really think about explicit bias and implicit bias, and specifically implicit bias, and how we can soak up information in our environment that might then unconsciously influence our actions in ways that we didn't intend. And I had to take a step back and start to think about, how does this impact how I behave, and how does this impact how I interact with others? Am I treating people differently on the basis of sex without intending to, certainly, and without realizing it? And it did lead me to make some uncomfortable realizations. And it was a really good opportunity for me to take conscious and intentional steps to address that, and to ensure moving forward that I was doing my very best to behave in the most objective and fair manner as possible, despite whatever I had floating around implicitly. So I think that just speaks to the importance of being willing and open to learn more about ourselves, even when they're uncomfortable truths, and even when we're faced with something that we don't want to believe because it doesn't fit with our understanding of ourself or our worldview. To look at it, as I've seen in the chat in a couple of places, sometimes recognize it's maybe not them, maybe it's me. And maybe even though I'm very familiar with and believe strongly in these things, I'm still human, as Dr. Metz had said earlier, and I still have flaws, and I need to recognize and address my own flaws as well. So that would be one example that I think was very eye-opening for me. Yolanda, just to build off of that, what can we do? What other kinds of things can we do to become more aware of our unconscious biases and what kinds of changes can we make as a result of our increased awareness?
Thank you, Stephanie. Well, as Robinson and colleagues mentioned in their 2020 article on the 5 R's of cultural humility, and Kara spoke on cultural humility as well, unconscious biases certainly can have a negative consequences at all levels within an organization. And first of all, acknowledging that having unconscious biases doesn't make us bad people. It's a part of being human. I think Kara emphasized that as well. So learning about and reminding ourselves about any affinity biases that we have can help lessen the impact on people in our out groups. And purposefully spending time with people who we perceive as being different from us and people who perceive us as very different from them can be helpful. Some questions to reflect on are, how have I benefited from affinity bias in my own career? Did someone in one of my affinity groups give me a key opportunity that contributed to my success? Who do I give opportunities to? Who am I mentoring and bringing into my groups to help them succeed? And what types of affinities do we share? We can complete a personal diversity profile which shows who am I more inclined to spend my discretionary time with, to go to lunch with, to chat with, to participate in activities outside of work. I have a form that I have my students, I invite students to do. It's called the Personal Diversity Profile. And it's called, it's an activity called How Diverse is Your Universe? And I'll put the link in the chat in a little bit. It can be very illuminating, and students have shared some very profound insights as a result of doing their personal diversity profile. The profile starts with the typical types of diversity common to justice, equity, and diversity dialogues. However, there is an other column that can be expanded to include the types of diversity addressed in the presentations our panelists did, as well as other types of diversity that we encounter. We can ask ourselves, with whom am I more, I mentioned, who makes me feel uncomfortable and why? Why do I avoid interacting with or giving candid feedback to certain individuals? Because I'm not sure how to relate to them, or because I'm afraid I'll make a mistake. So sometimes our lack of engagement may be well-intended because we don't want to make a mistake, but that still is a barrier. It's still an elephant in the room, preventing us from being fully present with that person as an individual. To whom do I give second chances and the benefits of the doubt? And keeping track of our surprises. So instances when something expected turned out to be quite different from what we expected. I call it busting our stereotypes. Those surprises offer a window into our unconscious. I remember being on a train to Madrid once, and it surprised me because I've preached the same thing to others, but outside of that context, I got caught off guard for a few seconds. I met an attorney on the train from Venezuela, and he said, "Eres Americano?" So he says, "You're American." And I said, "Yes." He says, "I am too." And for a minute, it caught me, and then I said, yeah, I know. I'm like, but even though I self-corrected quickly, and I've mentioned many times before and after that, Central Americans and South Americans are American too. It's still that there still must have been a little bias there for me to be caught off guard for a fraction of a second. So what do our surprises tell us about ourselves? The good news is that like correcting any type of habit or anything that's been learned, we can retrain ourselves to think in a less biased and stereotyped ways. So the implicit association tests have been mentioned. And just starting by paying attention to our thinking, our assumptions, and our behaviors, and then acknowledging, dissecting, and altering automatic responses to break underlying associations. One of the best techniques seems odd, but has actually been shown in research to have a lasting effect, is to think of a stereotype and just say the word no. and then think of a counter stereotype and say the word yes. People who do this have a greater long-term success in being able to interrupt their unconscious biases when they start popping up and leaking over into behaviors. And to decrease our implicit biases, we might also want to limit exposure to stereotyped images and deliberately expose ourselves to counter stereotypical models and images. And the last one I'll mention today, and then I'll put a resource that has way more examples of things we can do. I'll put that in the chat as well, is we can use mindfulness exercises. Research shows that mindfulness breaks the link between past experiences and kind of those automatic, impulsive, reflexive type of responses. And that can help to reduce implicit biases. So again, these are just a few strategies. I'll turn it back over to Stephanie, and I'll put some resources in the links in the chat.
Thank you so much. So we've reached the end of our predetermined questions, but we would love to open it up for questions from other participants in the room. I've seen lots of really great comments in the chat. I don't know that I've seen anything that's a question specifically. Feel free to unmute yourself and come on and speak if you'd like to ask a question that way as well.
I shouldn't be this excited. Thank you, Dr. Harper, for the personal diversity profile. And I am really excited about the tips you offered personally. So thank you very much for those.
Very welcome.
I'm trying to decide if I click on it, if it'll take me out of the room, but I really want it right now. That would be another thing. If folks have interesting resources to share, drop those in the chat. We all have similar, obviously similar interests in promoting this topic and can learn from those things from each other. Dr. Rosser Majors says, why do you all think that this subject can be difficult to discuss in association with an organization? Ooh, that's a good question.
I think I'll just start and then others please chime in. Well, first thing that comes to my mind is there's still at some level an association of bias being bad. And so I guess that's a bias in and of itself, right? and it causes us some cognitive dissonance and some discomfort in general when we bump into those biases. So I think that's one reason. And then people don't know what to do then once they have those bad feelings and how do they undo that? So that's my first thought. Others?
I think that's a good.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
This is what happens when we don't plan ahead. These are good questions.
Yes.
I think there's also that concern about disrupting the status quo. We notice something that's there, and now all of a sudden we are becoming part of what will be an out group. And based on our tenure or seniority or experience or expertise or gender or any other thing that can cause us to be part of an out group, there is concern that this is going to cause us to be displaced.
I would agree. And I would also say, I mean, it leads to a potentially uncomfortable conversation if we're confronting someone, even very, very gently with, oh, hey, I noticed you made this statement that could potentially be interpreted in this way. Most of us are not going to want to be, to hear that about ourselves. Now, we certainly want to hear and correct it, but it might initially sting. If it's not something that we were aware we were doing. And so it definitely can lead to some reluctance to put ourselves out there in that way.
That's a great example, Stephanie. And that also speaks to another personality diversity, because depending on how loud our inner critic is, that awareness brought to our attention may sting. And for others, it might be, oh, thank God you told me, I hope I don't do that again, So that also speaks to the importance of having some relationships with our colleagues that are not always about business, because it's much easier to give and receive that type of feedback with people you're already comfortable with, and to widen our circle of people in that network.
Mm-hmm. And to have folks around us. So when you were describing that, what I was thinking is having a friend who will tell you that you have a piece of lettuce in your teeth.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, we all need that person. And so to be accountable to each other in that way, it can be a really positive thing.
I love that. And if we all would just make that cognitive shift that, okay, they're exposing the lettuce in my teeth, then, I mean, that automatically, for me, would take a lot of the sting out of it.
Mhm, mhm.
And I'm one of those people, I'm grateful if someone, because, you know, I don't want to continue to be the elephant in rooms if I, in that way.
Certainly. A great point in the chat from Mia Falk. I think it also has to do with who's perceived to be in power. Is the discussion a genuine one or for appearances? And it goes to what Dr. Metz was mentioning earlier about being willing to be vulnerable. And I think that's so true. The way in which it's brought up, the context in which it's brought up is certainly going to make a difference in how receptive the person is to the information. So excellent point.
We
Yeah,
have
and certainly in a
just 2 more minutes.
Okay, thank you, Holly. We're wrapping it up. I would just say for power, you know, in the classroom, since the instructor begins with the most power, and certainly even as much as we try to equalize it, we're still assigning the grade, so you can't remove all of the power. But certainly those examples that Kara gave earlier can help balance the power a little bit more. But, okay. All right. Well, thank you all for attending and for participating in the chat. We thank you, Kara and Dana, for your presentations. And if you, again, just a plug, if you were not able to see all of the presentations in this panel, once the TLC recordings go live, I do encourage you to go back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Holly. You were awesome.
Thanks. Have a great day, everyone. We'll see you at the next keynote. Thank you, presenters, and have a great day.
Thank you.